Some time after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing those who were ill. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. We arrive now at the 4th sign, and I hope that you're enjoying this series. I'm sure that by now you've begun to see a pattern in the signs that we have dealt with. Today's is no different, but it requires a bit of insight into the Old Testament. It also needs to be heard with imagination. John didn't know that he was writing for people in the 21st century. We need to put ourselves into the sandals, see what I did there? The sandals of those who were with him on the day of the miracle or the sign. And we also need to understand that John had an audience that he wrote for. His intended listeners, who were probably a small, closed Christian community of Jews who had come to believe in Jesus as the Messiah, and were thus no longer welcome in the synagogue. There is evidence for this assertion, and I will mention one small piece of evidence in the 7th session of the series. For the time being, it is important to recognize that John is speaking to Jews with intimate knowledge of their faith, their history, their traditions. Most of us don't have that, which means that some of the significance of the signs are easily lost unless we do a bit of research. So let's take a dive into the text for today. John tells us that the crowd followed Jesus because of the signs that he had performed. Remember that John chose to relate 7 signs, but clearly Jesus performed many more. In John 20 verse 30, the Gospel writer tells us that Jesus performed many other signs. We'll look closer at this verse in the last session. This great crowd saw something special in Jesus, but were still seeking. It's interesting that in the Greek phrase, the sense is that they kept following him. They wanted more. They couldn't get enough of this new thing that was happening. Most of these people, if not all, were peasants. And this account took place in Greater Galilee, probably at the Golan Heights. The people were poor and lived hand to mouth, and they were also largely ignored when it came to matters spiritual, because Jerusalem was the main center, housing the temple and most of the religious leadership of Judaism at the time. Every now and then some Pharisees would show some interest, but mainly to condemn the way of life of the people on the ground and enforce those man-made laws. The crowd following Jesus was hungry, spiritually hungry. John also makes a point of mentioning that this event took place close to Passover. The people in the crowd and those that John is addressing, Jews, knew the significance of the Passover. This feast, many of you will know, celebrates the escape from slavery of Egypt. God miraculously provided a means for the people to leave their lives as slaves and enter into a new life as God's people. Freedom from slavery is what salvation was understood to be. The nation had been saved. Salvation. One of the key elements in remembering God's salvation at a Passover meal is the matzah, the bread. If served at the meal, it was a reminder of God's miraculous provision of daily bread in the form of manna in the desert. And so at Passover, thanks is given for the bread, with a prayer, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." And then it is shared and eaten. Another piece of the puzzle comes in the form of the Old Testament prophet Elisha. This great prophet miraculously divided 20 small barley loaves to feed 100 men, and there was food left over afterwards. Now we're going to read the passage when dealing with the questions, but the parallels with today's sign are incredible. Interestingly, the small boy in today's passage brings barley loaves too, not regarded as great food and usually reserved for the poor. It's also important that a poor little boy, the Greek word tells us this, he was a little boy, is the one who offers up the little that he has. Childlike faith and all. It just goes to show that on the journey with Jesus you bring patkos, because it might bless you and your neighbor. Now, without dwelling too much on the details, I do want to mention a few things. The first is that Jesus tests Philip. Where shall we buy bread for the people to eat? And Philip points out the lack of financial resources to accomplish the task. There isn't enough money. And Andrew then points out the lack of raw material, not enough fish and bread either. There's no hope. Perhaps Jesus wanted to point out to them that they had forgotten their faith. The Exodus was about 1,000 years earlier than this and had possibly developed a mythical quality to it, sort of believable, but those things only happened way back then. Jesus, we are told, instructs everyone to sit. Don't go anywhere, don't try and fix the problem. Sit and take notice. He then does what would happen at any meal where bread was present, and especially at the Passover meal. He took the bread, blessed it, or gave thanks to God, and distributed it. Here Jesus performs a miracle even greater than that of Elisha. At this point, Jesus is surrounded by a crowd that is at least 50 times the size of the group that Elisha fed. Remember, the 5,000 only refers to the number of men present, but there were women and children too. Jesus distributes enough food to completely satisfy everyone, and there are 12 baskets of leftovers. Now, the number 12 we know is significant to the Jews. It's the number of the tribes of Israel and a figure that denotes perfection. The image that John gives here is one of prosperity and abundance for the people of God. Now let's look at a few important things that the sign points to before moving on to the questions. Firstly, the sign points towards some sort of salvation for God's people. It mirrors the Passover celebration, which, as I mentioned, is one of God's salvation and emancipation of the people from slavery. John's Gospel also situates the Last Supper at Passover, And in a similar way to the wine in the wedding at Cana, the bread in this account becomes significant. The other Gospels and Paul tell us that at the Last Supper Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take, eat, this is my body." We celebrate this at communion as we remember our own salvation through Jesus' giving of his body for us. Secondly, the sign points to God's miraculous provision of manna in the desert. Here the provision is abundant, which links up with the previous point. And thirdly, it points to Jesus as a great prophet from God when read in light of Elisha's miracle. Jesus mirrors Elisha. These clues would not have been lost on devout Jews, and we are told that after Jesus had performed the sign, people proclaimed him as the prophet who was to come. But they didn't quite read the sign correctly. It was all about the magic of it and their tummies. And so they wanted to force Jesus to become their king. But a king is a political person. It's a political appointment. They wanted him for the wrong reasons, because although they realized that he was special, they didn't realize the fullness of who Jesus is. The salvation to which this sign pointed was not just economic. It is salvation for eternity. I mentioned earlier that the crowd was spiritually hungry. They probably didn't even know this. But Jesus came to satisfy this spiritual hunger. And I urge you to read the section from John 6:25 onwards. Here Jesus explains the sign further. If you go to the questions now, they will lead you on this journey. And for the next session, please prepare by reading John 6, verse 16 to 24. Until next time, God bless you.